Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Strategy Gaming Dojo, where we find, learn, and play one more turn of the great strategy games. Now, currently, we're making an introduction slash tutorial for John Tiller software games, and more specifically, we are playing his campaign Antietam American Civil War game to kind of go through the basics, to learn the system, to learn that John Tiller system that you can then take the basis of and go and play any of his games from any different era. So, Nate, you may remember last time in episode number 6, we talked about firing and meleeing, and in this episode number 7, we're going to kind of continue with that. We're going to talk about the different factors that go into firing. What are those modifiers? What does it all mean? The same goes for meleeing. There are different modifiers based on terrain or how your elevation, what kind of troops you have. And then we're going to get into disruption and routing and leaders. Now, I'm not sure if we can get to all of that this episode, but over the next couple, since those things all kind of work together, we will be talking about them, across those 2 to 3 episodes. So the first thing to do is back up for a second and say, well, what happened last time? Well, what happened was is we had a Union cavalry unit that had gotten across Blackburn's Ford, and James Longstreet and his men here from Virginia had meleeed with them, meaning they had attacked them, assaulted them hand to hand, which you have to do when you are separated just by a hex. So this got down to hand combat. Now, this unit over here, the 24th Virginia, had moved down into this little valley and had fired first. And then these units here then went on the assault, and that Union cavalry unit was completely destroyed. It was either disabled, those men were potentially killed, they may have been taken prisoner. For this game, essentially they're just gone. They're counted as having been taken off the map. And so we are left down here in this little valley, but let's talk about some of the modifiers for the things we did before. Now, we had talked about this last time. The Union unit had moved to this hex. So they were down in this little valley. You can see the elevation difference. 170 for the hex here, 170 here. This one here, though, if we look down here, is 140. So it was about 30 foot down in elevation. Okay. Um, this unit had also been here and it moved down and then fired from within 1 hex of this Union unit. Now, what difference did that make? Well, when you're looking at firing modifiers, the number one modifier for firing is how close you are to the enemy. So let's go up here and look. The 24th Virginia has a range of 2. If we look, they carry a musket. Okay? Let's go look at the parameters. So we will go all the way to the bottom where the weapon data is, and we will look for a musket. And once you kind of get the idea of this, I never really go look at these anymore because I played the game enough that I just understand kind of how much they're worth. But as you can see here, a musket is much more deadly at 1 hex as opposed to 2 hexes. As a matter of fact, it's 4 times as deadly. So at 2 hexes, its maximum range, it only gets a 1. At 1 hex, it gets a 4. Now you may say, well, okay, how does that translate? Well, when the game does its algorithm to figure out how many casualties there were on the other side, the the base value, the very first thing it figures is 451 men firing times that weapon score. So we saw if the musket would have fired from 2 hexes, it would have been 451 times 1. Since it fired from only one hex away, it's 451 times 4. So you can see moving units with muskets into very close range will cause a lot more damage. As a matter of fact, 4 times as much. Now, the game will calculate a high number of casualties and a low number of casualties, and then it averages them so that there's not these huge, sometimes you get 100 casualties, sometimes you get 10. Instead, that always kind of ends up somewhere in the middle around 55. It evens those out through an optional rule that we pick at the start of the game. And we will be going through the optional rules. That's what I'll do in the last episode of this series because I know a lot of tutorials or people that do these videos like to go through these optional rules right at the start and what you check and what you don't. To me, that doesn't make a lot of sense because if you don't understand the game, it's going to mean nothing to you. I mean, I might as well be speaking Greek to you when I say, hey, we're going to have this optional modifier of how the game averages casualties. I mean, to you, that would mean nothing if you hadn't seen the game played a little bit and we hadn't talked about some of these other concepts. So I will be doing the optional rules last and we'll go through each one and explain what they are so that you understand, oh, this is, maybe the best way to play the game, or this is the way I would like to play the game, but you'll actually understand what you're selecting. So anyway, back to firing. The other things that are modifiers on how much damage you do. So I'm talking offensively here. When you fire offensively, what modifies that? Well, if your unit is disrupted, you only do 50% of the amount of damage. And you may say, well, what is disrupted? We have not gotten to that yet. We are going to either this episode or the next one, but you'll see these units here that did the excuse me, that did the assault or melee last turn. They are what we call disrupted. Now, this game operates in what I kind of call the rule of twos, or that's the way I think about it anyway, which is every unit can either be moving or in combat. It could either be firing or meleeing if it attacks. Likewise, if it starts to suffer damage, it can either be disrupted or routed. Okay, so I think of this game in twos. I don't know if that's helpful for you, but I always think that there's got to be one of two states that these things are in. And disrupted is the lesser of the two. What's the best way to put it? I wanted to say disrupted again, but when a unit gets unsettled, let's call it unsettled. Maybe, they're thinking about cutting and running, or they're looking at each other, they're a little scared, they can be in one of two states, and disrupted is the lesser of those two states. Routed is when they route, these unit counters go flying back here, and you may find the unit back here after the turn. So routing means actually they kind of turn and run. Disrupted just means hey, they're a little agitated, they're a little unsettled, we're going to cut down by half generally of their effectiveness, but they're still okay. They're still okay. And when we talk about commanders, we'll talk about the effect commanders have on that disruption and on that routing. So anyway, back to the case at hand here, firing modifiers. If a unit is disrupted, it will only fire at 50% effectiveness. And so you can still fire at enemy units if you see this just disrupted. It's not as if it's incapacitated, which routing really is. Disrupted just means they're not completely in their best state. Maybe the lines have gotten off, guys are scrambling around. So they will fire at 50% effectiveness. If you've ordered them to build trenches or breastworks, so you've done in this one we can do breastworks, we can't do trenches. If you've ordered them to do that, then if they do end up firing, it's at 50%. Okay. The third one is it's another optional rule that's called quality. Um, so basically, this rule says, hey, you do want quality being taken into account when they fire and when they melee. So it'll be the same for melee. And it's basically, it's a very simple rule. If your units are quality A or B, which none of these are, if they are A or B, they get a 10% bonus when they fire or they melee. And if they're E or F, they get a 10% penalty when they fire or they melee. It's just a way of, further differentiating your troops. Now, you don't have to play that way. You could play whether it's a C, an A, or an F. It always, it's going to be the same amount of damage on the idea that, well, they're firing the same type of guns. It really shouldn't matter. I like to play with the optional rule on that quality does matter because if you have a group of troops that either have better morale, maybe they have more experience, which this number goes into all of that, then they should be able to fire better, especially fire better in the heat of battle, right? So if they're better quality troops, I think they should get a bonus. Or if they're raw or green, which would be an E or an F quality troop, they should get a penalty. That makes sense to me. I like that, rule, and I always pick and play that way. Now, another factor in firing modifiers are fatigue. So if your unit is tired, they are not going to fire as well. There's going to be a penalty. As a matter of fact, I'm sorry, medium fatigue, which is anything 400 or above, is going to start to erode your ability to do things based on fatigue. So, in that case, it would be a 10% penalty. If it goes above 600, all of a sudden it's a 20% penalty. And if it gets all the way to 900 or what's called max, and there will be a max in the parameters based on the scenario, if it gets all the way there, then it's a negative 40% for your effectiveness for firing, for movement. It affects a lot of things. So you've got to watch this fatigue. Now you can see here fatigue 40. This is our meleeers. They has meleeed. What a term, right? So you see, we get fatigue every time we move or attack. Now, that fatigue can be alleviated overnight, but you don't want to keep putting the same troops into battle all the time. You want to, if you can, if you have the option, you want to kind of rotate fresh troops in because if these guys start getting up above, 300, 400, 500, it really starts cutting into their effectiveness. Now, as you see, this is green. When we get to medium, it will get to yellow, and then eventually at high, it will get to red. And that will tell you, these guys need to be dropped back. They're too tired. They're not going to be as effective. And that goes into all kinds of modifiers, okay? Um, if your guys are doing defensive fire, they do it at 50% effectiveness. Now, we talked or we saw defensive fire last time. This Union cavalry unit fired defensive fire at us. And again, I tried to explain it last time, but I'll reiterate it because it's so important, which is in this game, since it's a turn-based game, when you move, okay, the enemy positions get to fire first if you're in range. So if you move into their range, the computer, the AI itself, will decide whether to take a shot at you. The same will be true of your troops. Let's just say we sit right here, and let's say a Union group comes down the road and stops right here. Now that is in our range. It's 2. And it doesn't matter if they fired or they haven't fired this turn. It's independent of everything that you do on your turn. The computer will automatically decide whether to take a defensive fire at that. So since the Union goes first, let's say that they do that in their turn. They move here. We defensive fire at them. Then it becomes our turn. You still will have all of your movement points and you will be allowed to fire and or melee that turn as if you never fired. It truly is just a computer construct, this defensive fire concept, that it gives the defense the first fire. The computer always decides whether to do it or not, and you have no control over it. So that defensive fire will come out at 50% of its effectiveness. So we talked about last time 451. This time they would be two away. So it would be 451 times one. Then you would cut that in half for defensive fire if the computer decides to do it. If you've moved in the turn, so I had said before, you can move, no problem. And I did the calculus here. So let's think about this movement that we did from here to fire. Now, I moved from here to here, which brought us from, a one modifier to a four modifier. So it was four times as deadly. But because I moved first, that then is a half, then it reduces it by 50%. Now that was worth it, right? So we go times 200 and then cut that in half, you end up ahead, right? Because this movement is a times four, but because you moved, it's divided by two. So it was a benefit, right? Let's just say, for argument's sake, that your weapons were just as effective here as they were here against a unit here. So they're just as effective from two hexes away as they are from one hex away. Then you would not want to move because that movement right there cuts your effectiveness by 50%. So those are some of the main modifiers. Also, there are defensive modifiers. Okay, so those were the offensive modifiers when you're on offense. When you're on defense, um, some of the modifiers will be if you do not move at all, you get a defensive bonus. Okay, I mean, that only makes sense, right? So let's say we're here, the Union comes down here next turn. We don't do anything. Maybe we fire at them, but we don't move, and then they move to the next hex. We get a bonus on the idea that in 20 minutes, we probably have found rocks to hide behind, maybe some trees, maybe we've dug into the side of the ridge here by the creek. There are a lot of different reasons why that would be, but you do get a bonus if you don't move in a turn. Okay, so it kind of goes back to the offensive bonus, but it's the same for the defensive. Terrain obviously gives you a bonus if it's available, if you're being fired at. Okay, so what we're talking about now is not you're firing, it's are you being fired at? So if this unit down here, see where it clears 0%, if we were up here, it would be negative 40. So if we were getting fired at into this forest, it would reduce the effectiveness of that fire against us by 40%. The final one I'll talk about is elevation. For every step of elevation, if you're being fired against and that fire is coming from below you, it is less effective. And that only grows with the change in elevation. So just as an example, let's say that there is a Union unit here. The elevation is 140. Then we go up to 170. By the time we get up to 200, the penalties for firing uphill like this become more and more severe. In a crazy scenario, let's say this went all the way to 300, they start to double as they go up each chain of elevation. So that's just really something to keep in mind if you're down here, and you're firing uphill, you're getting quite a penalty for doing that. And it's just something to keep in mind. Like every other kind of warfare, the high ground is generally going to be an advantage, whether that be melee fire, or otherwise. Now, I'm not going to go through all of the melee modifiers. Many of them are the same. It's based on fatigue. It's based on quality. There is an optional rule based on, do you melee better if you're a better quality troop? I always pick for that to be on. Um, and then you have everything else. What the elevations of the two different competing sides, the terrain that they're going through or that they're coming out of for the melee. And I'll let you look at the user manual for all of those. I mean, it would take a while. There are like 10. There are 10 for firing and there are 10 for melee. I'll tell you what, I never actually go look at them anymore. I have played the games for a while, but also they're just common sense. Uh, you know, Essentially, we would not have picked to do this melee or not to do this melee just because we're getting a small penalty or a bonus for coming from a higher elevation. We would have done it anyway. The only thing I would say that really maybe would take closer inspection is how much damage your guns do. Because this was a decision, right? We moved from here to here, which cut us by 50% our effectiveness because we had moved this turn. But it gave us a 4 times bonus on the damage. So you may want to, from time to time, go up to the parameters and say, well, how much damage does my weapon do from this many hexes? Does it make sense to move up 2 hexes? Does it make sense to move to the right 3 hexes? Whatever. You get the idea. The point being is, maybe with weapons damage, it makes some sense to go look, but really a lot of this is common sense. If your guys are tired, they're not going to fight as well. If they're coming from a lower elevation, they're not going to fight as well. If you're firing into a forest, it's not going to do as much damage. Again, just a lot of common sense. Also, I will point out for melee, if you are stacked with your leader, you get a bonus. And it's just the kind of thing, you see Longstreet right next to you jumping into this, little valley here to go hand to hand with the Yankees. It's probably going to inspire you to fight a little better, fight a little harder. And so anyway, I just kind of wanted to go through those because they're one of the most important parts of the game, obviously. If you're playing the game, you could just watch the computer do it if you weren't thinking about these modifiers, because to play the game really is to advantage your troops as much as possible. And if you eventually get to the point where you're playing other humans, it becomes all important, those little decisions of, do I get within 1 hex? Do I stay 2 hexes back? So on and so forth. So we've moved all of these men. There's nothing we can do. They have either fired or they have meleeed, which means they can no longer move, even if they had movement points left. As you'll see, when that happens, it no longer even displays any movement points. That means you cannot move again. So we will need to move some of our other things here. Now, these wagon trains, we have moved them. I'm just making sure. These guys are ready to fire. I'm actually going to turn him while we can. 1 click to the left. I will tell you one thing maybe I haven't mentioned is that guns will also do defensive fire. So if the Union comes down here, these guns, very possibly, if they feel like these troops down here are in danger, the computer will run a whole algorithm whether to defensively fire against Union troops. Now let's move these guys down here into position just so we have them. I think I'm going to keep him facing this way, and I'm going to keep him right there because he only has that range of 2. I think let's bring these guys down here. Okay. Now we've still got Bonham here. He's got 811 men in this unit with him, so that's fine. Keep him with the biggest stack. How many are these guys? 721, 789. So these are bigger units. 776, 734. Okay. Those are bigger units. Oh, yes. Now we have these guns here. Now, one thing I was thinking about doing is bringing them up here. And hmm, for this I don't think it's necessary. I think maybe we'll just stack them with the rest of the guys. What can we see from here? Well, we can't really see a ton. I was tempted to maybe bring them up here. They've got a range of 21. Yeah, let's do that. Let's bring them right here. And they still have 4 movement points. Let's see. Yep, we can unlimber them. That's great. Now they're facing into the forest. We don't have enough movement points to turn them. But I guess they could left shoulder fire here, right? So they could hit something if it moved over here, even though it looks like you guys are kind of facing the wrong way. And if you ever want to see where something is facing, you can go straight here to its unit card, and it will always show you. Uh, so this is their direct ahead, but this is their left shoulder. They could fire up this way and everything in between. So if something shows up here, they will be able to fire at it. Okay, well, let's back off a little bit and let's go through next stack. Okay, that's just Bonham. Those guns, they're facing the right direction and they're ready to fire. They haven't moved. They will be all ready to go. Oh yes, this wagon train. Let's move this wagon train over one more. Make sure that the elevation's the same. So this forest is 170. They're at 170. So the Union should not be able to see this wagon train. It should be hidden behind this forest. So this is good. It can supply everything within 5 hexes. It's got everything within 5. So that's perfect. Those guns we didn't move. This wagon train we didn't move. 4, 5. Now this is in range of the wagon train. These guys are not, but we are going to try to move them back up here, up the ridge, next turn. I don't want them down here. We just kind of had to take that opportunity, but I don't really want. Okay, so all units have been considered. Excellent. Now let's talk about the last sort of item for this episode that we're really going to get into next time as we get into it along with leaders, and that is disrupted. Now, what does disrupted mean? What does it affect? Um, disrupted really goes to the essence of this game and pretty much all of John Tiller's games, which is once you take casualties, how do your forces react to those casualties? And it really kind of gets down into the essence of warfare, right? You move around in your pretty uniforms, you're all ready to go. Let me tell you, at Blackburn's Ford, of course, we know a couple of days later at Bull Run that all of the fancy ladies of Washington, D.C. came out and had a picnic because they thought they were going to watch a spectacle of sorts, right? And when the gunfire started going off, everybody was disabused of the notion that this was just entertainment. Well, this system and Tiller's system really gets to the essence of that, which is you've got these troops who are all fine and dandy, ready to go, and then they start to bleed a little bit. They have some casualties. What happens at that point? Well, uh, a, the biggest variable of what happens at that point is this right here, quality C. And if you're playing a World War II game, it's called morale, but it's the same concept, which is this is a number between 1 and 6. A is 6, B is 5, C is 4, and so on, all the way down to 1, and F is 1. So these troops are actually a little above average. They're a quality C, so they're a 4, all right? Anytime that they take casualties, they have to do a dice roll. They have to take a dice roll that's called a morale check. Okay. So again, like I said, quality equals morale, morale equals quality. When they take casualties, they have to do a dice roll based on this number. So their number is 4, right? So anything that's 4 or less, they pass their morale check, what's called a morale check in this game. Okay? So they have a better than 50% chance. They have a 2 and 3 chance, right, of passing. They have a 66% chance as a quality C troop to pass because it could be 1, 2, 3, or 4, and they pass. A 5 or 6, they fail, right? So if a troop is a quality A and we were just looking at their base, their quality, or their base morale, if you play that World War II game, they would always pass. A quality A or a morale A troop would always pass if all we looked at was this base level. A quality B or a morale B would always pass unless you rolled a 6. If you rolled a 6, I say you, if the game rolled a 6, then they would fail. And what happens when they fail? Well, when they fail, they either get disrupted or they get routed. Okay. Um, and I think we're at 31 minutes here. I think I'm going to leave this episode right here. I just kind of wanted to set that up for next time. We are going to go into disruption and routing because they are the most important parts of the game, essentially, is what happens to your troops when they start to take casualties and how can commanders affect that. So we will get into that in the next episode. That will be episode number 8. Looks like this is going to be about 10 episodes, which is kind of what I planned at the start. So that'll be great. Hopefully, you're learning a great deal about this game system and it's made you want to play these games. They're well worth playing and learning. And again, like I say over and over, if you just stick through these 10 episodes, you'll be able to play all of his games and understand what's going on because these exact same concepts happen no matter what time era of his you play. So, as always, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you enjoyed it. I had a blast. If you did enjoy it, please give me a subscribe if you haven't already. I would appreciate it. And for Strategy Gaming Dojo, I'll talk to you next time.